What if I told you that your grandparents almost lived under Japanese military occupation? What if I told you that Japanese soldiers came within months of potentially marching down Hollywood Boulevard, and that enemy forces were already killing American civilians on American soil? This is alternative history, or Hollywood fiction. This is the classified reality that American schools have systematically avoided teaching for over 80 years. By the end of tonight's investigation, you'll understand how terrifyingly close we came to a reality where the rising sun flag could have flown over American cities, and why understanding this hidden history changes everything about how we view World War II. Here is what is going to shock you. Pearl Harbor was in Japan. Endgame, it was just the opening move in a series of strategic studies that explored bringing the Pacific War directly to American soil. While Hollywood movies and history textbooks focus on the surprise attack in Hawaii, they've completely ignored the theoretical invasion scenarios that Japanese military planners were actively developing, the submarine attacks that were already happening on the American mainland, and the enemy weapons that were already killing American families in their own backyard. Let's destroy the biggest myth first, that Japan never seriously considered attacking the American mainland. This is completely false. Japanese submarines were already attacking American soil, shelling oil refineries and military installations. Japanese forces launched over 9,000 balloon bombs across the Pacific Ocean, creating a terror campaign that reached as far as the American Midwest. One of these weapons killed an entire American family in Oregon on May 5, 1945, the only enemy action to cause civilian deaths on the continental United States during World War II. Think about that for a moment. Enemy forces were already killing American civilians on American soil, and most Americans today have never even heard about it. The reality is that Japanese military planners spent considerable time and resources studying potential invasion scenarios. These were desperate last resort fantasies. These were systematic, strategic analyses conducted by one of the world's most advanced military forces. Japanese intelligence had spent years gathering information about American coastal defenses, harbor layouts, and strategic infrastructure. They knew exactly where America was most vulnerable, and they had the naval and air power to potentially exploit those vulnerabilities. Let's start with the attacks that actually happened, because understanding how Japan was already striking the American mainland reveals just how real the threat was. On February 23, 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced off the coast near Santa Barbara, California, and fired 17 shells at the Elwood oil fields. While the physical damage was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time since the War of 1812, enemy shells had landed on American soil. This wasn't an isolated incident. The submarine I-25 later shelled Fort Stevens in Oregon, making it the only military installation on the continental United States to come under enemy fire during World War II. These submarine attacks weren't random harassment. They were carefully planned operations designed to test American coastal defenses and gauge the psychological impact of mainland attacks. Japanese commanders were studying how Americans would react to direct threats on their homeland, gathering intelligence for potentially larger operations. The fact that these submarines operated with virtual impunity along the American coast demonstrated just how vulnerable the United States really was in early 1942. But the most bizarre and terrifying demonstration of Japan's ability to strike America came through their Fugo balloon bomb campaign. Starting in November 1944, Japanese engineers launched over 9,000 hydrogen-filled balloons from the Japanese mainland, each carrying either incendiary or anti-personnel bombs. These balloons were designed to ride the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean, traveling 6,000 miles to strike targets across the American West. The engineering precision was remarkable. Japanese scientists calculated wind patterns and atmospheric conditions with extraordinary accuracy, creating weapons that could travel from Japan to America in as little as 3 days. Most of these balloon bombs landed harmlessly in remote areas, but their very existence proved that Japan possessed the technological capability to deliver death anywhere in America. Hundreds of these weapons reached American soil, landing in 16 different states, from California to Michigan. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate. Japan wanted to create panic, force America to divert resources to homeland defense, and demonstrate that no part of America was truly safe from attack. The tragic proof of their effectiveness came on that spring day in Oregon when Elsie Mitchell, a pregnant Sunday school teacher, was on a picnic with 5 children from her church. They discovered what appeared to be a large balloon caught in the trees. When they approached to investigate, the balloon bomb exploded, killing all 6 instantly. This was enemy action on American soil, killing American civilians, yet it remains one of the least known tragedies of World War II. These documented attacks provide the foundation for understanding just how serious Japanese strategic planners were about extending the war to the American mainland. If they were already successfully delivering weapons to American soil and killing American civilians, what would have happened if they had possessed the naval capacity for larger operations? Japanese military documents, declassified decades after the war, reveal extensive theoretical studies of potential invasion scenarios. These weren't concrete operational plans ready for immediate execution, but they were serious strategic analyses conducted by professional military planners. The studies focused primarily on the American West Coast, identifying potential landing sites, analyzing coastal defenses, and calculating the resources required for amphibious operations. The most detailed scenarios centered on California, specifically targeting areas like Monterey Bay. Japanese planners recognized that this location offered deep water access, relatively light defenses, and proximity to major population centers like San Francisco and Los Angeles. They understood that seizing key ports and airfields could potentially establish a foothold that would be extremely difficult for American forces to dislodge, especially if the U.S. Pacific Fleet remained crippled after Pearl Harbor. The scope of Japanese military capability in 1942 made these theoretical scenarios genuinely terrifying. Japan possessed the world's largest and most experienced naval air force, with pilots who had been fighting in China since 1937. Their navy included the largest battleships ever built, the Yamato and Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons and carrying guns capable of destroying entire city blocks from 20 miles offshore. They had developed specialized landing craft, amphibious tanks, and mobile artilleries specifically designed for beach assault operations. More importantly, Japanese forces had demonstrated their ability to conduct complex amphibious operations across vast distances. Their lightning conquest of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands in early 1942 showed remarkable logistical capability and operational coordination. If they could successfully invade and occupy territories from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, the theoretical possibility of operations against the American mainland couldn't be dismissed as pure fantasy. The psychological dimension of these potential operations was equally sophisticated. Japanese planners understood that American public morale was crucial to the war effort. They believed that direct attacks on the mainland, even if limited in scope, would create panic and potentially force political pressure for a negotiated peace. The balloon bomb campaign was specifically designed to test this theory, and the extensive media censorship required to prevent panic proved that Japanese assumptions about American psychological vulnerability were largely correct. American military leaders certainly took the threat seriously. Coastal defenses were rapidly expanded, blackout procedures were implemented across the West Coast, and martial law was declared in Hawaii. The infamous internment of Japanese Americans, while morally inexcusable, was partly driven by genuine fear that invasion forces might receive support from potential collaborators already in America. The fact that these extreme measures were implemented demonstrates that American commanders believed the invasion threat was real and immediate. But here is the crucial question that will determine the rest of our story. If Japanese strategic studies were so detailed, their military capabilities so impressive, and their willingness to attack the American mainland already proven, why didn't these theoretical invasion scenarios become operational reality? The answer lies in a 3-day naval battle in June 1942 that most Americans know about, but whose true significance in preventing potential mainland invasion has been largely forgotten. Hit that like button if this evidence is already changing your understanding of how vulnerable America really was in early 1942, because in our next section, we're going to examine the single battle that saved America from facing its greatest existential threat, and discover why one intelligence breakthrough turned Japan's theoretical invasion studies into impossible dreams. The margin between American victory and potential catastrophe was far thinner than most people realize. And the heroes who prevented that catastrophe deserve recognition for saving not just the Pacific Fleet, but potentially the American mainland itself. The single battle that saved America from the nightmare of Japanese occupation lasted just 3 days in June 1942, but those 3 days determined whether your grandparents would live as free Americans or under the rising sun flag. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a naval engagement. It was the moment when Japan's theoretical invasion studies either became operational reality or died forever in the Pacific waters. Here is what most people don't understand about the strategic situation in early 1942. Japan was riding an unprecedented wave of military success. Their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Their lightning conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands had demonstrated logistical capabilities that made mainland operations against America genuinely possible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, was already developing his next strategic masterstroke, one that would either give Japan absolute control of the Pacific Ocean or destroy their naval power forever. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was audacious beyond imagination. He would lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land in the Central Pacific that held enormous strategic importance. His fleet was the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. 4 aircraft carriers led by veterans of Pearl Harbor, 11 battleships including the massive Yamato, 13 cruisers, and 45 destroyers. This wasn't just a fleet, it was a floating empire capable of projecting devastating force anywhere in the Pacific, including potentially against the American mainland. If this armada had succeeded in destroying the American Pacific Fleet at Midway, everything would have changed overnight. Japan would have possessed unchallenged naval supremacy from the Aleutian Islands to Australia. The theoretical invasion studies that Japanese planners had been developing could have become urgent operational requirements. With absolute naval control, Japan could have chosen when, where, and how to strike the American mainland, seizing key ports, establishing air bases within range of major cities, and forcing America to fight a defensive war on its own soil. But here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn, involving one of the greatest intelligence breakthroughs in military history. The breakthrough came when they identified repeated references to a target designated AFEC in Japanese communications. They suspected AF meant Midway, but they needed absolute confirmation. In one of the most brilliant deceptions in intelligence history, they instructed Midway to send a fake radio message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AFEFian water supply problems. The trap had worked. They now knew with certainty that Midway was the target. This intelligence advantage gave Admiral Chester Nimitz the one thing he desperately needed, the element of surprise. Instead of being caught off guard like at Pearl Harbor, American forces would be waiting in ambush when the Japanese arrived. But even with this advantage, the odds were still heavily against the Americans. The Japanese fleet was larger, more experienced, and had never been defeated in a major engagement. June 4, 1942, began as a disaster for American forces. Japanese aircraft devastated Midway's installations, and the first wave of American torpedo bombers was virtually annihilated. Of 41 aircraft that attacked, only 6 returned, and they scored no hits. The Japanese seemed to be winning another crushing victory. Their carriers were preparing to launch a second strike that would finish off both Midway and any American ships foolish enough to challenge them. Then, in the space of 5 minutes, everything changed. American dive bombers, arriving at the perfect moment when Japanese fighters were at low altitude dealing with the torpedo attacks, caught 3 Japanese aircraft carriers with their flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were transformed into floating infernos within minutes. A 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was sunk later that day. Japan lost not just 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, but over 200 of their most experienced pilotsmen who had trained for years and could never be quickly replaced. The psychological impact of Midway on Japanese strategic thinking cannot be overstated. In a single day, Japan's offensive naval capability was crippled. The aura of invincibility that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies was shattered forever. More importantly for our story, any possibility of using naval power to support large-scale operations against the American mainland had been eliminated. Consider what would have happened if those American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, if Japanese damage control had been slightly more effective, if the intelligence breakthrough had failed. A victorious Japanese fleet, having destroyed the last major American naval forces in the Pacific, would have had months or even years of unchallenged supremacy. The strategic studies of mainland operations would suddenly have become urgent operational requirements. Japanese forces could have seized key ports like Monterey Bay, established air bases within bombing range of Los Angeles and San Francisco, and forced America to fight a two-front war while simultaneously supporting Britain and preparing for operations in Europe. But Midway changed everything. Instead of planning invasions, Japan was suddenly fighting for survival. The initiative passed permanently to American forces, and Japan found itself defending an overextended empire with diminishing resources. Yet this didn't mean the threat to the American mainland disappeared entirely. Japanese forces continued their campaign of terror against American soil, proving that even after their naval defeat, they remained capable of striking the homeland. The submarine attacks intensified throughout 1942 and 1943. The I-25 submarine launched a seaplane that dropped incendiary bombs over the forests of Oregon in September 1942, hoping to start massive wildfires that would terrorize the American population and divert resources from the war effort. While the plan failed due to wet conditions, it remains the only time enemy aircraft have ever bombed the continental United States. Japanese submarines continued prowling the West Coast, shelling installations and demonstrating that America's shores were never truly safe. The balloon bomb campaign reached its peak in 1944 and 1945, with over 9,000 hydrogen-filled weapons launched across the Pacific. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were carefully calculated psychological warfare designed to create panic and force America to divert resources to homeland defense. The tragic death of 6 Americans in Oregon, including 5 children and a pregnant Sunday school teacher, proved that enemy forces were still capable of killing American civilians on American soil, even as Japan's empire crumbled. Most Americans today have never heard of these attacks because the government censored news coverage to prevent panic. But the reality was that entire regions of the country lived in fear that the next attack might be larger, deadlier, or even the prelude to invasion. Coastal defenses remained in place throughout the war. Blackout procedures continued, and military planners continued preparing for the possibility that Japan might attempt desperate last-resort operations against the mainland. The human cost of this near miss with catastrophe is staggering to contemplate. If Japanese forces had established even a limited foothold on the American mainland, the civilian casualties would have been enormous. The Japanese military's conduct in occupied territories throughout Asia provided a terrifying preview of what American civilians might have faced. The systematic brutality, forced labor, and mass executions that characterized Japanese occupation elsewhere would likely have been replicated on American soil. Beyond the immediate human cost, successful Japanese operations against the mainland would have fundamentally altered the course of World War II and potentially changed the entire trajectory of the 20th century. America's ability to serve as the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with the weapons needed to defeat Nazi Germany, depended on the security of American industrial production. Japanese attacks on West Coast factories, shipyards, and transportation networks could have crippled the entire Allied war effort. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of the entire scenario: how unprepared America actually was for mainland defense in 1942. The Army units stationed on the West Coast were largely untrained, poorly equipped, and completely inexperienced in combat. Most of America's best troops and equipment were already committed to operations in the Atlantic or were being prepared for the eventual invasion of Europe. If Japanese forces had landed on American beaches in 1942, they would have faced opposition it was qualitatively inferior to what they had already defeated throughout the Pacific. As we prepare to examine the final phase of this incredible story, how America's response to this near catastrophe created the industrial and military machine that made future invasion attempts impossible, ask yourself this. If the Battle of Midway had lasted one more day, if American intelligence had failed, if those crucial 5 minutes had gone differently, how would your family's story have changed? Because the margin between American victory and potential occupation was measured not in months or strategic advantages, but in minutes and individual acts of heroism that prevented the unthinkable from becoming reality. This analysis is revealing how thin the line was between American security and American occupation. And prepare for our final section, where we'll discover why this hidden history has been systematically ignored, what it reveals about American vulnerability, both then and now, and why understanding Japan's secret invasion plans might be the most important lesson we can learn about the true nature of national security in an uncertain world.
The most shocking part of this entire story isn't just how close Japan came to invading America, it is what America did to itself afterward to make sure this nightmare could never become reality again, because the response to Japan's mainland attacks and invasion studies didn't just win World War II, it created the most powerful military-industrial complex in human history and fundamentally transformed American society in ways that still shape our world today. Even after Midway crippled Japan's offensive naval capability, the attacks on American soil didn't stop. Japanese submarines continued prowling the West Coast throughout 1942 and 1943, demonstrating that America's shores were never truly safe. The I-25 submarine launched a seaplane that dropped incendiary bombs over Oregon's forests in September 1942, making it the only time enemy aircraft have ever bombed the continental United States. The goal was to start massive wildfires that would terrorize the population and force America to divert precious resources from the war effort to homeland defense. The balloon bomb campaign that followed was even more psychologically devastating. From November 1944 through April 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 hydrogen-filled balloons carrying incendiary and anti-personnel bombs across the Pacific. These weapons could appear anywhere at any time without warning. American families across the West lived with the knowledge that enemy weapons might literally fall from the sky into their backyards. The tragic death of Elsie Mitchell and 5 children in Oregon on May 5, 1945, proved that enemy forces were still killing American civilians on American soil even as Japan's empire crumbled. But here is what your history textbooks never told you. The American government kept these attacks almost completely secret. News of submarine shellings and balloon bomb landings was heavily censored to prevent panic and deny Japan the psychological victory they sought. When that Oregon family died from an enemy weapon, it was classified. Most Americans lived through World War II without knowing that their homeland was under active attack by enemy forces. This wasn't just wartime security, it was the beginning of a pattern of information control that would shape how Americans understood their own vulnerability for decades. The fear generated by these attacks, even among the small number of officials who knew about them, triggered the most dramatic military mobilization in human history. Factories that had been producing automobiles were now building tanks. Women who had never worked outside the home were now assembling the bombers that would carry the war back to Japan. The entire American economy became a weapon specifically designed to ensure that no enemy would ever again possess the capability to threaten American soil. This wasn't just about winning the current war, it was about making future invasion attempts impossible. The coastal defense systems constructed during this period were unlike anything America had ever built. Gun emplacements capable of sinking battleships were installed at every major port. Underground command centers were constructed to coordinate defensive operations, even if surface installations were destroyed. Most remarkably, entire underground aircraft factories were built in California and Washington, designed to continue producing weapons even if Japanese forces occupied the surface. The scale of this defensive preparation reveals just how seriously American leaders took the invasion threat. But the most significant response was the development of long-range strategic bombing capabilities specifically designed to carry the war to Japanese soil and destroy their ability to project power across the Pacific. The B-29 Superfortress program consumed more resources than the Manhattan Project and was specifically designed to make Japanese invasion planning impossible. When these aircraft began systematically destroying Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945, they weren't just shortening the war, they were eliminating Japan's capacity to threaten the American mainland forever. This transformation had consequences that extended far beyond World War II. The industrial capacity built to defend against Japanese invasion became the foundation for Cold War military production. The scientific research networks established to develop better defensive technologies evolved into the innovation systems that created everything from computers to space exploration. The strategic thinking that emerged from confronting homeland vulnerability shaped American foreign policy for generations. The near miss with Japanese invasion in 1942 created the strategic mindset that would define American power for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Yet this crucial chapter of American history remains largely unknown to most Americans today. Why has such a significant threat been forgotten? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how we construct historical narratives. The story of near catastrophe doesn't fit the triumphant narrative of inevitable American victory that dominates popular understanding of World War II. Acknowledging how close we came to disaster would require confronting the reality that American security has always been more fragile than we like to admit. The government's wartime censorship of Japanese mainland attacks evolved into a post-war silence about homeland vulnerability. Officials who had lived through the crisis understood how close America had come to catastrophe, but they also understood that this knowledge might undermine public confidence in American invulnerability. The result was a systematic de-emphasis of Japanese mainland operations and invasion studies in favor of narratives that emphasized American strength and inevitable victory. But what would have been the true cost if Japan had succeeded in establishing even a limited foothold on American soil? The consequences would have been catastrophic beyond imagination. The Japanese military conduct in occupied territories throughout Asia provided a terrifying preview of what American civilians might have faced. The systematic brutality, forced labor, and mass executions that characterized Japanese occupation elsewhere would likely have been replicated on American soil. Millions of American civilians would have found themselves under a regime that had already demonstrated its willingness to commit unspeakable atrocities beyond the immediate human cost. Successful Japanese operations against the mainland would have fundamentally altered the course of World War II and potentially changed the entire trajectory of the 20th century. America's ability to serve as the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with the weapons needed to defeat Nazi Germany, depended entirely on the security of American industrial production. Japanese attacks on West Coast factories, shipyards, and transportation networks could have crippled the entire Allied war effort, potentially prolonging the war in Europe by years or even leading to a German victory. Consider the psychological transformation that would have occurred. The confidence, optimism, and sense of invulnerability that defined post-war America would have been shattered forever. The scars of foreign occupation would have shaped national identity and foreign policy in ways we can barely imagine. The America that emerged as a global superpower might never have existed. This brings us to the most chilling what-if scenario of the entire war. What if those American dive bombers at Midway had arrived 5 minutes later? What if the intelligence breakthrough that revealed Japanese intentions had failed? What if Yamamoto's massive armada had achieved its objective of destroying the last major American naval forces in the Pacific? A victorious Japanese fleet with unchallenged naval supremacy would have had months or even years to choose when, where, and how to strike the American mainland. We might have seen Japanese soldiers marching down Hollywood Boulevard, American cities under foreign occupation, the arsenal of democracy forced to defend itself instead of supplying the world. The entire global balance of power shifted toward fascism, the Holocaust potentially continuing indefinitely. The margin between the world we know and this nightmare scenario was measured in minutes at Midway, in the skill of codebreakers working in basement offices and in the courage of dive bomber pilots who arrived at exactly the right moment to change history forever. The lessons from this hidden chapter of World War II remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. They remind us that vulnerability is real, even for superpowers. That intelligence and preparation are a nation's first line of defense. That adversaries will always seek new and unexpected ways to exploit weaknesses. And that the security we take for granted has always depended on the dedication, skill, and sometimes luck of people who prevented unthinkable scenarios from becoming reality. Most importantly, this hidden history forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our understanding of the past is often shaped by convenience and national myth-making. The narrative of an invincible America, always victorious and never truly threatened, is comforting, but it obscures vital lessons about national security, resilience, and the true cost of conflict. So here is my final challenge to you. If Japanese forces had succeeded in establishing even a limited foothold on American soil, how would your family's story have changed? If the Battle of Midway had lasted one more day, if American intelligence had failed, if those crucial 5 minutes had gone differently, would you be living in the same world today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Were you shocked to learn how close Japan came to potentially invading America? Did this change your understanding of World War II and American vulnerability? Comment invasion if you think it could have actually happened, or impossible if you believe America was always safe. Hit subscribe if you want to see more hidden history that challenges everything you thought you knew about America's past, because the most important lessons aren't always the ones they teach in school. They're the ones that reveal how thin the line has always been between security and catastrophe, and why understanding that reality might be the most important knowledge we can possess in an uncertain world. The Japanese Empire's secret plan to invade America didn't succeed, but it came far closer to reality than most Americans will ever know, and that's a truth that changes everything about how we understand both our past and our future.